Thanks very much, Dr. Thitinan. I think you've covered just about everything that anyone could possibly raise a question about, but as with all our panellists, they've raised many issues that will hopefully give rise to some good questions, which we'll turn to in a minute. But I'd just like to take advantage of being a moderator here to pick up on a very interesting point you raised about whether, and ask Murakoshi-san, in fact, when you said, Dr. Thitinan, about the sense perhaps that Japan did was fundamental to the development of this region, and a sense that you suggested might be that there's something slipping away there, and the rise of China and the great game sort of politics you've outlined. Murakoshi-san, do you feel that in a way Japan might have a sense that things are slipping away a bit? Sorry.
Frankly speaking, I'm not represent to the Mr. Abe from the Prime Minister of Japan. So that, I'm not not talking about political itself, but politics is one of the big important factor where we will do the business. It is correct. And frankly speaking, the Japanese company has no intention to fight against China, because everybody knows that we already invested further huge money to China already. Sometimes we have a joint venture with the Chinese company and attacking to the other regions. Please understand, political issues and private sector is still different. This is one thing. Then another thing is, just only talking about greater Mekong sub-region areas. Up until now, we don't feel that Chinese company is not like our competitors. We don't recognize Chinese company, private company is not serious competitor up until now, because investment, there is a two aspect in the investment, the world of investment. What we Japanese doing is invest to the manufacturing, well, that's a long-term investment. Then create a set up factory and employ type people, and like automobile industries. It took a very long period, and already we have the a Thai top management. Some part it becomes Thai company. Then this is one thing. The another investment is like to take infrastructures business or this kind of things. Of course, we Mitsubishi is also working for the infrastructure business. Such like high-speed train or such kind of things. Of course, we recognize Chinese company may be our good competitors. Then maybe we have to discuss about two parts in long-term investment or such infrastructures. Just in one time business. This is I'm not sure that it is answer from your questions, but
no, it's excellent. Very, very interesting view. So unless anyone would like to add to that, we might turn to the floor and see if there are questions.
This is all very interesting presentation. I think the key issue is indeed the reality check. How far is this integration going? I think we have talked about logistics. You could do the same about trade. intra-regional trade remains still lower than trade with other parts of the world, and you could do with many other topics. My concern now is really about the question of who is benefiting from this development. Unfortunately, social impact of regional integration have not been discussed here, and environmental impacts have just been touched upon at the end, but I want to raise a number of issues. Labor in the regional integration is unskilled labor, which is very important for Thailand and for other countries, but is exploited, and there are many rights abuses. The issue of ethnic communities living in the mountainous area now being put down by road development, by all kind of other development in that area is affecting their life. Ethnic conflict, the Rohingya is a very clear example of ethnic and religious conflict and how to deal with that. So it's becoming more inclusive or less inclusive in terms of cultural diversity, land expropriation. A lot of people are losing their land again because of infrastructural development and all the rest. Environmental concern have already been mentioned. The informal economy, I mean, we have talked here about the formal economy, while the informal economy is much larger and often has to do with things like casinos, prostitution, corruption, and all kinds of other things that, again, have not been mentioned here. I am just giving some example. You could do many more examples, but I think we cannot separate this discussion. We cannot have a forum on the economic aspect and a forum on the social and environmental aspect, because the two are clearly connected, and you cannot have distribution of benefits and poverty alleviation and all the rest without also looking at all this social and environmental trade-off that happens with the choice, the economic choice that are being made in the region. The dam is a clear example. Now it's being promoted as green environment solution. But we know it's not as simple as that. Now, the dams are not only built by China, are also financed by the World Bank and many private investors from French, Italy, and all kinds. Thailand is also a main investor. So these issues are very complex, and I think it would be very important to keep it together, to keep the social, the environmental, and the economic together. This is just a comment, but I look forward to your reflection on this.
Look, I'd like to do a couple of things. One is to put things in perspective. You mentioned somewhere along the way, you mentioned a lot of topics, that the informal economy is larger than the formal economy. That's in fact not true. You know, the formal economy is still large and larger than the informal economy, which doesn't get to say that the informal economy isn't important. So in all of the issues that you raised, they're absolutely essential. But I want to start by saying that and reiterating that the topics that were mentioned before in the panel, you know, ranging from, you know, the geopolitical environment to, you know, standard traditional economic growth, income growth, you know, the logistics for business, the logistics for the people, you know, even for us individually as we cross borders. These are everyday problems that concern everybody. And in fact, the large majority of people are going to be in a very major way affected by them. Which doesn't mean that the particular challenges of ethnic minorities, religious minorities, you know, low-skilled migration across borders, discrimination, brutal treatment, oppression sometimes of these groups, you know, things like prostitution, child labor, all these very ugly social problems, that they aren't important. They're absolutely critical. But I think it's important to keep perspective on, you know, that they are important, and the other issues are also important. It's not one at the expense of the other. The second thing I want to say is that take a couple of the specific points you mentioned. I think it is correct, and is fundamentally a critical challenge that I also highlighted, is who is actually benefiting from integration. And if you look around the world at examples of successful integration and less successful integration, both in trade and investment, and I mean, the slide that you showed shows the, is it geographic projection of gains in the absence of policy. I think it's one example you can look at this. You can look at it in different ways, make different assumptions, but it is true that in many examples of integration, integrative processes, the average is on average, people increase, people gain. There is a growth gain. For example, if you look at CAFTA in Central America, NAFTA, trade unions, usually trade unification, when countries come together on trade in different parts of the world or in investment, on average they gain, but there are winners and losers usually within the countries, in the individual countries, and also across countries. It is very important to do the analysis right, and there are particular policies that countries can take to increase the gains. And they have to do with things like socially inclusive policies. Also, with, in particular, when there are investments and investment projects that have potentially adverse environmental effects, for example, of putting in place relevant regulatory regimes, relevant protection mechanisms. But the most important thing is not just to put the regulations there, but to enforce them, to implement them. And I think one lesson from what you showed is, there often can be beautiful protections on paper, but they are not actually implemented. And I'm not saying that with respect to any individual project in any individual country right now. We can talk about that separately and offline. That will be quite interesting, but I'm happy to do that. But I think that's a general point that cuts across all the countries in the region, in fact, all these regimes, that the real challenge lies in the implementation of these protections. Now, one of the things that happens when the World Bank Group becomes a financier of some of these investment projects. One of the most well-known is the Nam Tun Tun project in Laos, hydropower project. When the World Bank Group becomes a financier, then it's not like when individual bilateral countries become a financier, like Sayaburi or others. And when we do that, we make sure it's our responsibility. We are accountable for the fact that there is compliance with environmental and with social standards. And the private investors who are involved in these projects equally must comply with those standards. And of course, that doesn't mean that everything is perfect, but it does mean that in case there are glitches, in case there are issues, we can follow up on them, and we will follow up on them. So there is a level of protection, a level of comfort that comes from having the World Bank Group or the Asian Development, for that matter, participate in such a project. And when we don't do that, when there is no such protection, typically the protections for the people who get resettled typically are weaker. And now for the countries that undertake these investments, they have a choice often. Do I finance the investments with capital, which is relatively cheaper, which comes without these requirements for environmental and social protection and safeguards, if you will, or do I do that with somebody like the World Bank Group, which quite frankly does put these constraints on investments, and so it's more expensive and less convenient for the countries and for the people who invest. But sometimes people do it because they know ultimately the investments will be more sustainable and will be done better on average than if you do it without these protections. So that's on this particular issue of the investments and the social environmental safeguards. On the unskilled labor, yes, that's a huge issue, and it's an issue across the borders in this region. And I think there are both social issues there, and they have to do with all the things that you mentioned. Part of that is highly politically sensitive among the countries in the region. It's something where also the UN institutions and the United Nations have a great role. I don't think there's a representative from the UN here yet. There are human rights issues involved, which is not our particular expertise as a World Bank group, but it's something we follow very much. I think in terms of labor mobility, I would just like to highlight that this is an issue both for skilled and for unskilled labor. It's not only for unskilled labor, and that's also where the gains come from. If you look at Thailand, Thailand has been, essentially exploiting its comparative advantage in relatively cheap, unskilled labor, and both from within Thailand, but increasingly from outside Thailand, as labor within Thailand has become gradually more skilled. So these are issues. When you look at the long-term comparative advantage, I think in Thailand it will not continue to be purely from unskilled and cheap labor. It will increasingly come from more skilled labor, and then the question is, where does the unskilled labor come from? What happens to private investment? Maybe our private sector representatives can say more about this, but I think the interesting thing from the perspective of this panel is how to look to the future, and what are the policies that individual countries can take, both to reap the gains from this integration in terms of mobility of skilled and unskilled labor, but also to give the relevant protections to the people who are involved. And I think that's a social issue which cannot be disconnected from the economic issue, as you mentioned. Lots to say. You talked about land. You talked about lots of things. I won't cover everything because otherwise I'll talk until the evening. So I propose we'll take the rest offline. And but I can't possibly cover everything, okay? Thanks.
No, thank you for a very good response there. And I know, Dr. Ruth, you had a small point to make.
Yes, one small observation. You were referring to the informal economy. Well, when we talk about logistics best practices, that's where you have in the informal economy. Why? For example, all the fake goods that are coming in from China into Thailand, or the distribution system of the methamphetamine. And in fact, the private sector can learn a lot from this type of system because, one, it is flexible, two, it is resilient, three, it is very cheap. So there's a lot that can be learned, and you see the best practices in that informal economy. I tried to do some research on it, but the only problem was if I started to do like the logistics of methamphetamine, I probably won't be able to do a presentation on the results. So that was one point related to informal economy.
Thanks for that. Well, Murakoshi-san, do you have anything to say on this issue, particularly of skilled versus unskilled labor? I know that it's a big issue for all business in this region.
About the skilled labor and unskilled labor, I think her question is a very, good questions. Who got the benefit of, by integration of this region is a good questions. Then answer is correct. I'm also emphasize that to every people living in this area should take such profit. This is the first thing. Then this is my advertisement of our company. We Mitsubishi have three principles. The first one is a contribution to the society. Second is honesty and transparency. Third one is business for the global. Then as we Mitsubishi Corporation is acting as global companies, so that even we are doing the business in this region or like Africa, we have to follow the some level in the advanced country like the United States. Otherwise, our another business will be affected. So we are keeping very high ethics, even in other regions. But I believe that, of course, this such kind of problems we are facing in some countries. Even before the Thailand, I stayed 7 years in Brazil. Well, there we have such kind of problems. Or actually, how can I say, this is, well, so many such kind of things. But, from, businessman side, if we working hard and the economy level increase, some part will be solved automatically. This is my, opinions. So that, from such viewpoint, we are working hard in this country. This is my answer.
Thank you very much. And over to you, Tetsuya.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Leah, for bringing up these points. These are issues that are the underbelly of the good story of mainland Southeast Asia, the GMS. In fact, there's really a mixed bag. There's an underside to it. Apart from all the issues you've raised, it's not just unskilled labor, it's unskilled migrant labor, which means if you're unskilled labor in the same country, you have some rights. Unskilled migrant labor, you have very few rights. So the mistreatment is even greater, and the exploitation is a lot more. So the issues you've raised, I would add human trafficking, transnational crime, natural disasters. A lot of these issues fall under what we refer to as a non-traditional security agenda. The haze as well. The problem that we have here in this region, in the Mekong region, is that the institutions are weak. So these problems are more acute and accentuated. Very difficult to deal with them. And I think that in the longer term, it's a collective challenge. It's probably the gravest collective challenge of these regional countries. When they have these problems that are cross-border problems, they don't have the institutions and the framework to regulate, to deal with them, to handle. And this leads to all kinds of outcomes that we don't want to see. There'll be greater inequality. So inequality exists within each country. So you'll see a lot of rich people emerging in Myanmar, and certainly you see Laos and Cambodia, but very poor people at the same time, and the gap is greater. And then you see Thailand developing at the expense of Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia to an extent. So the inequality goes cross-regional and also within each country. I would say between the formal and informal economies, formal economies have greater value, certainly. But the informal economies, because they're informal, we don't have the data, but they certainly involve a lot of people, affect a lot of people. So I think that the informal economy is something that we have to try to formalize, kind of make them kind of more inclusive. Otherwise, we will have more problems with inequality and so on, and all the issues that you raised.
Thanks, Dr. Ting. I'll just add to that. Are you actually arguing for strengthening of, there are these existing regional institutions such as, the Mekong River Commission, etc., those sort of institutions. There's national institutions and there's ASEAN overall. What kind of strengthening of institutions, maybe you could elaborate?
If you look at the ASEAN framework mechanisms, they don't really address many problems that ASEAN has. And in fact, you might say that ASEAN is weak because it always has to rely on external mechanisms and partners in order to address internal challenges. If you look at the Rohingya problem, for example, the controversy, Rohingya Bengali controversy in Myanmar is ungovernable. Is ungovernable. So what I'm saying is that we have to come up with institutions and rules to handle and address these challenges. Otherwise, the good story will be outshone by the underbelly.
Thank you very much. I know Pete. Oh, sorry.
I just want to add one point, I'm sorry, on this. You mentioned the Rohingya question is ungovernable. I think will be an interesting question, is it ungovernable? I actually would submit not. I think this is an issue for Myanmar, and it's an issue for good policy. And it can be very eminently addressed through good and appropriate policies, which are policies of inclusion, which means that you have a policy where nationally you provide equal access to education services, health services, infrastructure services across the entire territory to all the people of Myanmar. You adopt that as a national policy. Now, that is not what Myanmar is currently doing, but that is what Myanmar is intent to do when Myanmar says we want to have universal access to health services. They are intent, and they're saying we want to provide health services to everybody. And that includes all the people living, in Rakhine State, including the Rohingya population, as well as the Rakhine population, as well as everybody else. And you can go through health policies, education policies, everything else. That is ultimately the future, and that is the way to solve that issue eventually. Now, that's not where Myanmar is right now, but it is an issue that's accessible to policy making and to good governance. Now, not necessarily within ASEAN and not necessarily within this GMS region, but it is a domestic political issue for Myanmar, which has side effects, if you will, because the Rohingya are obviously fleeing across the borders of neighboring countries, but it is an issue that ultimately has its resolution within Myanmar.
I think just very quickly, the issue we're discussing is, regional governance of problems within one country, they impinge on other countries. The Rohingya problem is one. And if you look at the regional framework, what has ASEAN done about Rohingya? Certainly, Myanmar needs to do something about Rohingya. It seems intractable to me. But Myanmar can do something if they get it right. But if you look at problems that occur in one country and impinge on other countries, there are many problems and all the issues that Dr. Leah raised, plus more. There is no we lack effective institutions and rules to address these challenges.
Right.
Hey, Dr. Ruth, I'd like to follow up on one of your observations that if you want to get funding for a project in Thailand, you have to put in AEC and logistics, yeah? The last three governments have all proposed rail links between Laos and Thailand and various connections, yeah. Laos itself, I think, or it's always a little bit fuzzy up there, but I mean, certainly they've been talking about, and they seem quite determined to go ahead with a rail link that's going to cost like 70% of their GDP or something. And yet, on your slides, you don't have any rails there, just talk about roads, and similarly for World Bank, it seems that the rails just seems to be in pipe dreams or something. Do either you or Dr. Ulrich take these rail projects at all seriously, or are they just politics? Yeah?
First of all, when we look at rail from a regional perspective, basically there is only one coordination agreement, which is basically the Singapore-Kunming rail link, the SKRL, which is under an ASEAN committee. In the GMS, I think rail came later, so the initial focus was more from the ADB, focusing on the road, on the bridges, and when after they've realized that, we have put enough money for the road, now they're starting to think about the rail, so it's a bit more on a sequential perspective. But what is very interesting when you look at rail is that, one, you have the regional platform, which is going very, very slow, and then you have the domestic policies, and I think this is where you're referring to, like in the case of Thailand, where we went from a proposed project of high-speed train into a proposed project of almost high-speed train, right, 250 to 160 kilometers. My comment on the rail is this, yes, rail is important, it needs to be improved, but the challenge that we're seeing, especially with what is happening in the country, is we're basically saying goodbye to ASEAN connectivity and we're saying hello to China connectivity. Why am I saying that? Because the rail gauge, that means the width of the rail in ASEAN, is a 1 meter gauge. But the two lines that they want to do from Nong Khai down to Map Taput, Lam Chabang, and from Chiang Khong down to Lam Chabang is a standard gauge, which is 1.435. So it's a Chinese system. So it's going to be interesting, I think, for Thailand to explain to the other ASEAN members countries, saying, now for railway connectivity, which is part of the master plan on ASEAN connectivity, ASEAN connectivity is still important, but we're focusing now more on this almost high-speed train with a different type of system and of gauge. I don't want to say that railway is a poor cousin, but what we have seen also very often is a lot of these regional priorities very often are superseded by national priority. And let me give you one example. In the Singapore-Kunming rail link, you're supposed to be able to establish a link between Phnom Penh and Ho Chi Minh. But when you talk with the Vietnamese railway, for them, their core project is a north-south from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh high-speed train. Yes, it's important to link with Phnom Penh, but the resources are finite, so they can't really do it. So you are, I think, a bit stuck in between this regional dynamic and the national priorities that has to be put in place. And I think all the countries are struggling. The case of Laos is more like, okay, who is going to come in and give it to them? But like in the case of Vietnam, they have their own priorities. And when we start talking about the regional, there is no fund, in fact, to support these type of regional initiative. You look at ASEAN, there isn't fund in ASEAN. There's a China Infrastructure Fund, but you don't see it going into the rail system at the present moment. Hope I've answered some of your questions.
Thanks very much. And Ulrich, Nitnoy, you said.
Yeah, very Nitnoy. Two quick points. First, I think the important thing is to look at, in each case, at all the possible alternatives, which means both road and rail, as well as any other modes of transport. In some cases, you have actually possibilities for air traffic, in some cases, water. So it's really looking at all modes of transport and doing a proper cost-benefit analysis, including all the possible costs and all the possible benefits. And I think from an economist's perspective, that's what we would advise to do. And when we're asked, that's what we would support. So we do look at it seriously, and in some cases rail does turn out to be economically the best alternative. Now that doesn't always mean that it's done, but it is important to look at the economic costs and benefits of different modes of transport. I would say that I would very much concur that with what I detected implicitly in what you said is that the political economy and the politics of the different interests and what are national priorities are probably more easily managed on road than on rail. And that is a reason why a road has sort of is much more in the focus of, I think, most politicians' interest, apart from the fact that it's easier to cut a ribbon on a road than on a rail. But I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much. And even more Nitnoy is Thitinan.
Just, when I did the research for this article, I had to look it up. So the road has always outstripped the rail. But in this region, in the GMS, more than Europe, more than most other regions, there are 540,000 miles of roads in the GMS countries, but only 11,700 miles of rail. The roads the increase in road networks is 37% in the last decade, as compared to about 10% for rail. So this means that there are a lot of roads around here, but at the same time, it means also that the space for rail development is huge. It's huge. It's just beginning.
First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Ruth for your very specific proposal for the transportation. As in 2011, I was working for the OTIF, Intergovernmental Organization for International Carriage by Rail in Switzerland. At that time, even in Europe, they don't have the way to send document electronically from one country to another country. There were a few bilateral agreements between Germany, Austria, Germany, France, and I think in Europe they have worked together for more than 20 years to have this system, the electronic document system. I think if we are positive, if the private sector really work that hard, we might achieve some kind of international cooperation, and we might also be as well start to develop on our own. And the second point I would like to ask the representative from World Bank Group. Last week I also participated in ASEAN International Conference. It was about governance efficiency in ASEAN. And also the representative of World Bank also expressed a concern about the freedom movement of labor in ASEAN. I find that in many occasions, people try to compare ASEAN with the European Union, which I find it could be convenient. But we also have to have in mind that European Union and ASEAN have but very different historical approach. In 1951, the Treaty of Paris is the first treaty that established European Coal and Steel Community. In this treaty also state about right to free movement for workers in specific industries. So in the European Union, the right to free movement for workers have been in place for more than 60 years. And it was also because of the context of the European at that time that Germany need a lot of Italian workers from Hungarian and the neighbor countries to work in the restoration of the nation. But in ASEAN, we don't have that. In ASEAN, normally people can move freely within the sub-region, especially in the Mekong Mainland. So in ASEAN, we never talk or never intend to talk about labor, free movement of workers. What we talk about is the free movement of services. So people also try to say that.
Sorry, could you just maybe tell us the question, because we're running out of time. So.
Yes, sure. I'm coming to that.
Thank you.
The free movement of services, and people tend to say that in Thailand, if you want to be a doctor, you want to practice doctor, you have to pass the Thai examination, which is maybe ridiculously in Thai, and that is the obstacle for people from other countries or for ASEAN countries to work in Thailand. My question is that not the same in Germany? People have to speak German to pass the doctor examination, and in France as well. So my question is that I don't really understand why people try to put this examination in Thai as an obstacle for freedom of services, and that's my question.
Okay,
thank you.
When I was in Malaysia about 6 months ago, and we gave a talk about ASEAN, and actually one of the topics we covered was labor mobility, and in particular the mobility of professions, including doctors and lawyers and various other professionals. And in order to do that, we had to actually look across, countries all around the world. And I gave the example of football because when it was the time of the Football World Championship, and so when you look at football teams, the most successful teams have players from all over the world, and that's not a coincidence. Now, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but you can take analogies from football and from anywhere else in the world. If you have that diversity of players and you're able as an employer and to source your skills from everywhere around the world, you're actually going to be more productive. And that can be shown. I mean, there can be analysis around this. I won't bore you with that, but you can show that. And ditto, if you are looking at the perspective of the provider of the service, if you're a doctor or a lawyer, whatever, you actually have greater chances, and we're going to have over a lifetime higher income and higher productivity if you can work in different places and can source and supply your skills to different employers. So this is just in terms of gains from that, both the demand side of the skills for labor, which is the employers, typically the private sector, as well as the supply side, which is the workers themselves, have advantages from that. Now, specifically as regards Germany, Germany, to my mind, and I'm saying this as a German citizen, is not a shining example on their citizenship tests, and it has to do with all the kinds of prejudices and biases that peoples have against each other. In this particular case, many Germans and many German politicians espouse some kinds of biases against immigration, especially in this case from Turkey, which is the largest share of foreign workers, and so they have put in place language tests, but they are not actually, interesting thing is, tests to work as a professional in Germany. They are tests to take citizenship. And if you look at countries of the United States, they have excellent doctors from all over the world. They have excellent health care, but there are no provisions that you need to qualify as a doctor, but there is no citizenship requirement or other requirement like that, and I don't think the healthcare quality has suffered. And I think you can give similar examples from other professions. The same is true for engineers and for lawyers and so on. So these mutual recognition agreements for professions are something that not just Thailand but other countries could in place. It would help Thailand, it would help all the countries. There are nationalist barriers to that in all the countries, but economically there is no good reason to maintain them.
Thank you, and I think the football analogy there applies there too. If you look at some of the national teams of some countries, they waive all kinds of citizenship provisions for a good footballer.
You can look at who won the last World Championship.
Okay, thank you. And over to you, Dr. Ruth, for that earlier question on the rail.
So, when you're talking about the system, this is what is currently happening within ASEAN. As one of the conditions for ASEAN to become an economic community, the ASEAN single window has to be in place. The challenge is this, is that in order to have the ASEAN single window, it means that all the 10 members countries of ASEAN need to have their own national single window. Right, and that is a prerequisite. And there has been a time frame that has been agreed upon. The problem that we're faced with at the moment is the ASEAN single window is considered one of the prerequisites of the AEC, but a lot of the countries are in fact very much delayed in terms of the implementation. If you look at the case of Thailand, do we have a national single window? Yes, but is it integrated? No. Why? Because you still have some agencies that do not want to link into the main system, which is managed and held at customs. So we are seeing that, yes, there are systems being in place, like in Cambodia, in Laos, the World Bank has been very active with the Azikuda project. Vietnam is developing its own system, but there's one part that is missing is, yes, at the end of the day, we might be able to achieve our own national single window, but then the next question is, how do you link with the ASEAN single window? And this is something from a technical perspective which hasn't really been dealt with. Let me finish off with one last example. From a customs perspective, there's a very important document which is the ASEAN Custom Declaration. A single custom declaration for the whole of ASEAN. I think that is something that is very good. Currently, we are at an impasse. Why are we at an impasse? Because one country cannot agree with the other 9 countries. For the paper document, no problems what kind of data needs to be filled in, but Singapore cannot agree with it because in Singapore everything is electronic. So they don't want to go back to a paper-based system. So these are the challenges that we are being faced with when we talk about the integration, especially from an information perspective. I'm not saying we are not going to arrive and be successful. I'm just saying, well, I think it will take a longer time and probably longer than what the private sector expected, but maybe faster than what the government sector expected.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I am Akira Murakoshi. I used to be the ambassador in the EU. I had been there about 8 years. What I like to comment is that after listening to the discussion just went before, it seems that on our side we are talking a lot about the problem of integrations. We are a little bit impatient, But in Europe, when I was ambassador there, I saw all this problem. I saw a lot of trucks, at the border. It became news every day because of the lack of a single document. Then the law came in with the single market. It solves a problem. So in our case, I think integration will be useful, but it will take some time, to solve all this. And I view integration process as a dynamic one. It would move on from one level to another. Regarding the mutual recognition agreement also, in Europe, they had a lot of training and practice. They have gestation period also. I remember a lot of people could have come to work in Europe, from Eastern Europe, from Sweden, even from Turkey. Turkey was a historical thing. They came to Germany for a long time. So all this will solve. The question of a lot of questions that we have talked about, because we have learned from Europe, the lesson of Europe. And Europe's measure, they have already culminated. They are nearly 100%, complete. But we are just starting, so we will see a lot of problems. So take heart, we are doing well. And what may I just say a little bit that the seminar is very good.
Very quickly, because we're practically out of time. I'd like to thank each of our panelists today. I think the discussion's been insightful and excellent. So a big hand to all our panelists, and thank you for coming.